So I'm hoping most people have been able to get back in. I'm just going to introduce Eric, and then we can go straight into the talk. So yeah, Eric is a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside. He has written widely on philosophy and psychology, philosophy of mind, moral psychology, and classical Chinese philosophy, and maintains one of the philosophy community's leading blogs, The Splintered Mind, which I believe was last updated 2 days ago, so it's still very active. His books include A Theory of Jerks and Other Philosophical Misadventures, Perplexities of Consciousness, and Describing Inner Experience, Proponent Meets Skeptic. He has also been a leading figure in the philosophical science fiction movement, having published stories in Cloudsworld, Nature, and Science Fiction World, amongst others. He's going to talk today. His talk is about borderline consciousness. Assuming you're ready to go, Eric? Yeah, so I'll hand it over.
All right, thanks. Everyone can see and hear me and see the share screen, yes? All right, great. So, let's see if I can get this advanced. So, yes, so I'm going to defend the existence of what I'm going to call borderline consciousness. So by borderline consciousness, I mean cases where phenomenal consciousness is neither determinately present nor determinately absent, but rather somewhere between. In borderline cases, it's neither determinately true nor determinately false. There's something it's like to be the entity in question or to have the state in question. Right, so phenomenal consciousness is thus a vague property, on my view. It's like the property of being bald or green or extroverted. It's unlike the property of being exactly equal to 4, or the property of a hydrogen electrons being in the ground state orbital. Baldness, greenness, and extroversion admit of indeterminate, borderline, in-betweenish cases, a balding man in the gray zone just shy of outright baldness, a shade of turquoise that's kind of between blue and green, someone who's not quite a full-on extrovert. With vague properties, like being bald or green or extroverted, and on the view I'll defend, also phenomenally conscious, there are gray zones inhabited by in-between or borderline cases in which the property is neither determinately present nor determinately absent. Now, of course, the logic of vagueness is contentious. So if you prefer a different approach, I hope that you can translate my claims into your preferred approach, right? The core claim is not about the nature of vagueness. The core claim is that phenomenally conscious is a property that's like canonically vague properties like baldness, greenness, and extroversion. So my claim isn't merely that conscious experiences can have vague contents, right? So you might be able to imagine a speckled hen without imagining determinately how many speckles it has. You might see a string of text in your peripheral vision without seeing exactly what words compose the text, right? So you might determinately have experiences like that have some indeterminacy in their contents. That determinately feels like something to imagine that hen or to see those peripheral letter-like shapes. That's not borderline consciousness, right? Borderline consciousness is more difficult than that to imagine or remember. In fact, as I'll argue, there's a sense in which borderline consciousness is impossible to imagine or remember. So my argument in brief is this. In considering what types of earthly systems are conscious, we face a quadrilemma. Either only human beings are conscious, or everything is conscious, or there's a sharp boundary between across the apparent continuum between conscious systems and non-conscious ones, or consciousness is a vague property. Right, so we got a quadrilemma, and then we ought to reject the first 3 of those options, which leaves us with a 4th, vagueness. And then I'll conclude with some plausible cases and applications. All right, so here's the quadrilemma. What kinds of systems are conscious, right? Are frogs conscious? Garden snails, lizards, earthworms, honeybees, jellyfish, sea sponges, house cats, black widow spiders, trout, coral. Might some plants be conscious? Under what conditions, if any, might an artificial system such as a computer be conscious? Without attempting to settle on a specific set of answers, we can see 4 general shapes that a set of answers might take. Right, so horn 1 is human exceptionalism. On Earth right now, only human beings are conscious. There's something it's like to be a human, but there's nothing it's like to be any other type of entity, not even an ape or a dog. On this view, to be a dog, everything is dark inside, right? Or not even dark, right? Dogs react to visual and olfactory stimuli. They howl in seeming agony. They leap up and wag their tails in seeming anticipation of going for a walk. But beneath that all, they're no more conscious experience than there would be in a stone or in a toy robot on standard views of stones and toy robots. Similarly, no plant, no corporation, no currently existing computer is conscious. Human beings are determinately conscious, and everything else is determinately non-conscious. Right, so that's horn 1. Horn 2 is panpsychism. This is recently been getting a lot of attention in philosophy of mind. Right, on panpsychism, you say frogs, snails, lizards, all the rest. They're all conscious. Coral, they're simple sessile polyps with nerve nets instead of brains. The C. elegans roundworm has only 302 neurons total. The sponge lacks a neural system entirely, but they all have conscious experiences. You know, dreary monotony might be the sponge's fate, but there's something it's like to be one, right? Waving around in the current, expelling indigestible material. Not only is every animal conscious, right, but so also is every plant, every computer, every microorganism, every elementary particle. All right. Horn 3 is saltation. According to this view, there's a line in the sand, right? Some non-human systems are determinately conscious, and other non-human systems are determinately non-conscious, with no gray area. Among animals, for example, there might be one or more minimally conscious species that just barely possess consciousness, while other species, virtually identical but slightly less sophisticated, entirely lack consciousness. Maybe one species of toad has just barely what it takes, while another nearby species lacks that little smidgen extra. And finally, horn 4, my preferred horn, indeterminacy, right? Some systems, humans, apes, and dogs, are determinately conscious. Other systems, elementary particles, sea sponges, are determinately non-conscious. Somewhere in the middle are systems of indeterminate and intermediate status, capable only of borderline consciousness in the sense I've described. This indeterminate middle might be relatively low on the scale of neural and cognitive complexity. Maybe jellyfish are in this gray area, or it might be relatively high. Maybe lizards are in the gray area. The indeterminate middle might be relatively narrow. For example, among currently existing animals, maybe only cnidarians are in it, right? That's the class that includes jellyfish. Or it might be really broad, right? This gray area might go all the way from jellyfish to lizards. Either way, however you decide those particular questions, there's no sharp line that divides the conscious organisms from the non-conscious ones, right? So these 4 options, they're logically exclusive, and they're exhaustive if we assume that humans are determinately conscious. Now, I've framed the quadrilemma in terms of conscious and non-conscious systems, since that's more intuitive than some other framings. And we can think of, but there are various ways you could rerun this this quadrilemma with different kinds of targets. We can think of a determinately conscious system as any system that sometimes enters determinately conscious states, even if it's not always determinately conscious. All right, so now to keep the presentation brief, I'm just going to assume that we reject human exceptionalism and panpsychism. These are definitely minority views that are highly unintuitive. And that leaves us then with a choice between saltation and indeterminacy. We can talk about human exceptionalism and panpsychism during Q&A if you want. All right, so part one, contra saltation. Consciousness is a categorical property with probably a graded basis. Think about baldness and extroversion. Baldness is a categorical property with a graded basis. A person is either determinately bald, determinately non-bald, or in the gray area in between. In that sense, baldness is categorical. However, the basis or grounds of baldness is graded. That's number of hairs and maybe how long, thick, and robust those hairs are. If you have enough hair, you're not bald, but there's no one best place to draw the categorical line. Similarly, greenness and extroversion are categorical properties with graded bases that defy sharp-edged division. In contrast, being in the ground orbital is a categorical property without a graded basis. That's the quantum insight in quantum theory. Bracketing cases of superposition, the electron is either in this orbital or that other one discretely. There's discontinuity as it jumps rather than gradations of close enough. Similarly, although the real numbers are continuous, a 3 followed by any finite number of 9s is discretely different from exactly 4. Being approximately 4 has a graded basis, but being exactly 4 is sharp-edged. Now, most naturalistic theories of consciousness give consciousness a graded basis. Right? Consider broadcast theories, like Dennett's fame in the brain theory. On such views, a cognitive state is conscious if it's sufficiently famous in the brain. That is, if its outputs are sufficiently well known or available to other cognitive processes, such as working memory, speech production, or long-term planning. Fame, of course, admits of degrees. How much fame is necessary for consciousness, in what respects, to what systems, for what duration. There's no theoretical support for positing a sharp categorical line, such that consciousness is determinately absent until there's exactly this much fame in exactly these systems. This is explicitly acknowledged by Dennett and by early Ty. I haven't yet read Ty's new book. I haven't got it yet, but apparently his position is modified on this. I'm eagerly looking forward to looking at that carefully. Global workspace theories similarly treat consciousness as a matter of information sharing and availability across the brain. This also appears to be a matter of degree. So maybe typically, once a process crosses a certain threshold, it tends to quickly become very widely available in a manner suggestive of a state transition. Nevertheless, if you look at the empirical details, measured responses and brain activity are sometimes intermediate between standard conscious and non-conscious patterns. And if you look at non-human cases, the graded nature of global workspace theories is even clearer, and Carruthers makes this point in his 2019 book. Even entities as neurally decentralized as jellyfish and snails employ neural signals to coordinate whole body motions. Is that workspace enough for consciousness? Artificial systems also could presumably be designed with various degrees of centralization and information sharing among their subsystems. Again, there's no reason to expect a bright line. Or consider a very different class of theories which treat animals as conscious if they have the right kinds of general cognitive capacities, such as universal associative learning or trace conditioning, or in Merker's language, the ability to match opportunities with needs using a central motion stabilized body world interface organized around a sensory motor ego center. So these capacities are also things that come in degrees. How flexible exactly must a learning system be for it to underwrite consciousness? How long must a memory trace be capable of enduring in a conditioning task? What modalities, under what conditions? How stable must the body world interface be, and how effective in helping match opportunities with needs? Once again, the categorical property of conscious versus non-conscious rests atop what appears to be a smooth gradation of degrees, varying both within and between species, as well as in evolutionary history and in individual development. Similarly, higher order cognitive processes, self-representation, attention, recurrent feedback networks, even just having something worth calling a brain, all of these properties, all of these candidate grounds of consciousness are either graded properties or are categorical properties, like having a brain, that are in turn grounded in graded properties with borderline cases. Different species will have these properties to different degrees, as do different individuals within species, as do different stages of individuals during development. Look from one naturalistic theory to the next, each grounds consciousness in something graded. Probably some such naturalistic theory is true. An entity is conscious if it has enough of property X, where X depends on which theory is correct, and where enough is a vague matter. There are few truly sharp boundaries in nature. Now, I see two ways to resist the conclusion, which I'll call the phase transition view and the luminous penny view. All right, so let's do the phase transition view first. Water cools and cools, not changing much. Then suddenly it solidifies into ice. The fatigued wooden beam takes more and more weight, bending just a little bit more with each kilogram, then suddenly it snaps and drops its load. On the phase transition view, consciousness is like that. The basis of consciousness might admit of degrees, but still there's a sharp and sudden transition between non-conscious and conscious states. When water is at 0.1 degrees Celsius, it's just ordinary liquid water. At 0.0 degrees, something very different happens. When the global workspace, say, is at size x minus 1, sure, there's a functional workspace where information is shared among subsystems. There's unified behavior of a sort, but no consciousness. But when that workspace size hits x, when there's that last crucial neural connection, perhaps, bam, suddenly everything's different. The bright line has been crossed. There's a phase transition. The water freezes, the beam snaps, consciousness illuminates the mind. Now I'll present a caveat and a dilemma. The caveat is, of course, water doesn't instantly become ice. The beam doesn't instantly snap. If you zoom in close enough, there will be intermediate states. The same is likely true for the bases of consciousness on naturalistic views, unless those bases rely on genuine quantum discontinuities. So someone committed to the impossibility of borderline cases of consciousness, even in principle, even for an instant, as a matter of strict necessity, ought to pause here. If the phase transition from non-conscious to conscious needs to be truly instantaneous without a millisecond of in-betweenness, then it can't align neatly with any ordinary non-quantum functional or neurophysiological basis. It will need somehow to be sharper bordered than the natural properties that ground it. Here's the dilemma. The phase transition view is either empirically unwarranted or it renders consciousness virtually epiphenomenal. So here's the first horn. When water becomes ice, not only does it change from liquid to solid, But many other properties change, right? You can cut a block out of it. You can rest a nickel on it. You can bruise your toe when you drop it. When a wooden beam breaks, it emits a loud crack. The load crashes down, and you can now wiggle one end of the beam without wiggling the other. Phase transitions like this are notable because many properties change suddenly and in synchrony. But this doesn't always appear to happen with consciousness, and that's what precipitates the dilemma. There are phase transitions in the human brain, of course. One is the transition between sleeping and waking, right? Much changes quickly when you wake up. You open your eyes, you gather more detail from the environment, your EEG patterns change, you lay down long-term memories better, you start to recall plans from the previous day. However, this phase transition, that one at least, that's not the transition between non-conscious and conscious, or at least not as a general matter, since you often have experiences in your sleep. Although people sometimes will say they're unconscious when they're dreaming, that's not the sense of consciousness at issue here, since dreaming is an experiential state, right? There's something that's like to dream. Now, perhaps there's a phase transition between REM sleep associated with longer narratively complex dreams and non-REM sleep, but probably that isn't the phase transition between non-conscious and conscious either, since people often report dream or other experiences during non-REM sleep. Similarly, the transition between anesthesia and normal waking experience doesn't appear to map neatly onto a sharp conscious, non-conscious distinction. People can apparently sometimes be conscious under general anesthesia, and there appear to be a variety of intermediate states and dissociable networks that don't all change instantly and in synchrony, even when there are also often rapid phase transitions. Now, you could speculate that all of the subphases and substates of sleep and anesthesia divide sharply and into determinately conscious and determinately non-conscious. You can speculate that, but the empirical evidence does not provide positive support for that view. The phase transition view, to the extent it models itself on water freezing and beams breaking, is empirically unsupported in the human case. Sometimes there are sudden phase transitions in the brain. However, the balance of evidence does not suggest that falling asleep or waking, starting to dream or ceasing to dream, falling into anesthesia or rising out of it is always a sharp phase transition between conscious and non-conscious, where a wide range of cognitive and neurophysiological properties change suddenly and in synchrony. The phase transition view, if intended as a defense of saltation, is committed to a negative existential generalization, right? There can be no borderline cases of consciousness. This is a very strong claim, which fits at best uneasily with the empirical data. Now, I want to emphasize that last point as a way of clarification, right? So the phase transition view commits to the non-existence of borderline consciousness ever. This is a much bolder empirical, that's much bolder than the empirical claim that transitions from non-conscious to conscious states are typically phase-like. So my view, denying the phase transition view as defined here, in no way conflicts with empirical claims by, for example, Unchio Lee and Stanislas Dehaene, that phase transitions are typical and important. Now, the phase transition view looks even weaker when we consider human development in non-human animals. Now, it could have been the case that when we look across the animal kingdom, we see something like a phase transition between animals with and without consciousness. These animals over here have the markers of consciousness and a wide range of corresponding capacities. Those animals over there don't, with no animals in the middle. Instead, non-human animals have approximately a continuum of capacities. Similarly, in human development, we could have seen evidence for a moment when the lights turn on, so to speak, in the fetus or the infant. Consciousness arrives and suddenly everything's visibly different, but there's no evidence of such a saltation. All right, so that's the first horn for the phase transition view, except the sharp transition between consciousness Non-consciousness and consciousness should be accompanied by the dramatic and sudden change of many other properties, and then face the empirical evidence that the non-conscious conscious border does not always involve such a sharp, synchronous, wide-ranging transition. Now it can escape, the phase transition view can escape this horn of the dilemma by retreating to the second horn, of course. According to second horn phase transition thinking, consciousness is cognitively, behaviorally, and neurophysiologically unimportant. Although consciousness always transitions sharply and dramatically, nothing else needs change much. The lights turn on, but the brain activity need hardly change at all. Lights turn on, but there need be no correspondingly dramatic change in memory or attention or self-knowledge or action planning or sensory integration. All of the latter can still change slowly or asynchronously in accord with the empirical evidence. So that view is unattractive, I think, for at least three reasons, right? First, it dissociates consciousness from its naturalistic bases. We began by thinking that consciousness is information sharing or self-representation or whatever, but now we're committed to saying that consciousness can change radically in a near instant, while information sharing or self-representation or whatever hardly changes at all. Second, this view dissociates consciousness from the evidence for consciousness, right? The evidence for consciousness is presumably performance on introspective or other consciousness or other cognitive tasks, or neurophysiological conditions associated with introspective reports and cognitive performance. But now we're postulating big changes in consciousness that elude such methods. And third, most of you, I assume, think that consciousness is important, not just intrinsically, but also for its effects on what you do and how you think. But now consciousness seems not to matter much. So the phase transition view, right? It postulates a sharp border, like the change from liquid to solid, where consciousness always changes suddenly with no borderline cases. It's this big change that precipitates the dilemma, since either the phase transition advocate should expect there always also to be sudden synchronous cognitive and neurophysiological changes in contrast with the most natural reading of the empirical evidence, or they should not expect such changes, making consciousness approximately epiphenomenal. Now, the saltationist can escape these objections by denying that the sharp border involves a big change in consciousness. It might involve, instead, the discrete appearance of a tiny smidgen of consciousness. And that is the luminous penny view. According to the luminous penny view, right, being conscious is like having money. You might have only a little money, or you might have a lot of money. But having any money at all is discretely different from having not a single cent. Maybe a sea anemone has just a tiny bit of consciousness, a wee flicker of experience. At one moment, a barely felt impulse to withdraw from something noxious. At another, a general sensation of the current sweeping from left to right. Maybe that's $1.50 worth of consciousness. You, in contrast, might be a consciousness millionaire with richly detailed consciousness in many modalities at once. However, you and the anemone on this view are discretely different from an electron or a stone, which are entirely devoid of consciousness. Imagine the visual field slowly collapsing. It shrinks and shrinks, shrinks until nothing remains but a tiny gray dot in the center. Finally, the dot winks out. Right, in this way, there might be a quantitative difference between lots of visual consciousness and a minimum of it, and then a discontinuous qualitative difference between the minimum possible visual consciousness and none at all. On the luminous penny view, as I'm calling it, there's a saltation from non-conscious to conscious in the sense that there are no in-between cases in which consciousness is neither determinately present nor determinately absent. Yet the saltation is to such an impoverished state of consciousness that is almost empirically indistinguishable from non-consciousness. Analogously, in purchasing power, having a single penny is almost empirically indistinguishable from being entirely bankrupt. Still, that penny's worth of consciousness is the difference between the lights being on, so to speak, and the lights being off, right? This is why I think of it as a luminous penny. So this view escapes the empirical concerns that face the phase transition view, since we no longer ought to expect big empirical consequences from the sudden transition from non-conscious to conscious. However, the luminous penny view faces a challenge in locating the lower border of consciousness for both states and for animals. Let's start with animals. What kind of animal would have only a penny's worth of consciousness? A lizard, maybe? That seems an odd view. Lizards have fairly complex visual capacities. If they're visually conscious at all, it seems natural to suppose that their visual consciousness would approximately match their visual capacities, or at least that there would be some visual complexity, more than the minimum possible, more than a tiny gray dot. It's equally odd to suppose that a lizard would be conscious without having visual consciousness. What would its experience be? A bare minimal striving, even simpler than the states that I imaginatively attributed to the sea anemone? A mere thought of here now. More natural is to suppose that if a lizard is determinately conscious, it has more than just the minimal speck of consciousness. Right? To find a minimal case, we must look towards simpler organisms. All right, how about ants? Or my favorite, garden snails? The argument repeats. These entities have more than minimal sensory capacities. So if they're conscious, it's reasonable to suppose that they have sensory experience with some detail, more than a penny's worth. Reasoning of this sort leads David Chalmers to a panpsychist conclusion. The simplest possible consciousness requires the simplest possible sensory system, such as the simple too cold versus okay of a thermostat. Right, so the luminous penny view faces its own dilemma, right? Either slide far down the scale of complexity to a position that's nearly panpsychist, thus putting us back on horn 2 of the original quadrilemma, or postulate the existence of some middle complexity organism that possesses a single dot of minimal consciousness, despite having a wealth of sensory sensitivity. State transitions in adult humans raise a similar worry. We have plausibly non-conscious states on one side, arguably dreamless sleep, indisputably conscious states on the other side, normal waking states, and complex transitional states between them that lack the kind of simple structure one might expect to produce exactly a determinate penny's worth of consciousness and no more. If consciousness requires sophisticated self-representational capacity, as for example in higher order views, then maybe lizard or garden snail consciousness is out of the question. But what kind of animal, what kind of state would have exactly one self-representation of maximally simple content? You know, always only I exist and nothing more? Self-representational views fit much better with either phase transition views, if they could be empirically supported, or with gradualist views that allow for periods of indeterminacy as self-representational capacities slowly take shape. To quote Wittgenstein, a natural reading of a kind of higher order or self-representation view of consciousness involves light dawning gradually over the whole. If you're looking for a penny, ask a panpsychist or ask a near cousin of a panpsychist, like an integrated information theorist. Maximally simple systems are the appropriate hunting grounds for maximally simple experience. From something as large, complicated, and fuzzy bordered as brain processes, we ought to expect either large sudden phase transitions or the gradual fade in of something much richer than a penny. Now, here's the main objection that I normally hear to borderline consciousness and that you see in the literature. It's the inconceivability objection. Borderline consciousness might seem inconceivable. We can imagine that there's something that's like to be a particular garden snail at a particular moment, or we can imagine that there's nothing it's like, but it seems impossible to imagine it's sort of being like something. How might such an in-between state feel for the snail? As soon as we try to answer that question, we seem forced either to say that it wouldn't feel like anything, or to contemplate various types of conscious experiences the snail might have. We can imagine the snails having some flow of experience, however limited, or we can imagine the snail being an experiential blank, but we can't in the same way imagine some in-between state such that it's neither determinately the case that the snail has consciousness nor determinately the case that the snail lacks it. Even a dim light is a light determinately on. Even a flickering light is determinately on or off at any particular moment. Similarly, we can imagine what it's like to be in a hazy, confused state immediately after waking. We can imagine, maybe remember, feeling unsure where we are, being unable to clearly distinguish dream from reality, not yet having a sense of the coming day. Maybe that's what it's like sometimes to slowly awaken. But in imagining this, we seem to be imagining a state that's determinately conscious. We can also, in a different way, imagine being in a dreamless sleep with no experiences whatsoever, though of course we can't imagine what it's like to be in a dreamless sleep because there's nothing it's like. As soon as we try to imagine the transition between non-conscious and conscious, between non-conscious sleep and dream, or between non-conscious sleep and waking, we start to imagine dream experiences or waking experiences or confused half-awake experiences. That is, experiences of some sort or other. We imagine that it's like nothing, 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 something, something, something. Between nothing and something, there's no middle ground of half something. A half something is already a something. Borderline consciousness, it seems, must already be conscious, or else it's no consciousness at all. So I grant that all of this is highly intuitive, and such considerations on their face present a serious obstacle to understanding what could be meant by borderline consciousness. What kind of state could the phrase even refer to? Before admitting the existence of borderline or in-between states of consciousness, we want to know what such a state would be like. We want a sense of it, a feel for it. We want to remember some borderline experiences of our own. Before accepting that a snail or a frog might be borderline conscious, neither determinately lights on nor determinately lights off, we want at least a speculative gesture for the experiential character of such in-betweenish phenomenology. I feel the pull of this kind of thinking, but it is an illegitimately paradoxical demand. An implicit standard of conceivability drives the demand, which is impossible to meet without self-contradiction. The implicit standard appears to be this: before granting the existence of borderline consciousness, we want to be able to imagine what it would be like to be in such a state. But of course, there's not determinately anything it would be like to be in such a state. The more we try to imagine what it would be like, the worse we miss our target. If you look through a filter that shows only determinately bald people, you won't see anyone who's borderline bald. But you ought not conclude that no borderline bald people exist, the fault is in the filter. The fault is in the imaginative demand. In another sense, borderline states of consciousness are perfectly conceivable. They're not like four-sided triangles. There's no contradiction in the very idea. A philosophically inclined middle schooler on their first introduction to imaginary numbers might complain that they can't conceive of a number whose square is -1. What is this strange thing? It fits nowhere on the number line. You can't hold 3i pebbles. You can't count 3i sheep. So-called imaginary numbers might seem to this middle schooler to be only an empty game with no proper reference. And yet there's no contradiction in the mathematics. We can use imaginary numbers. We can even frame physical laws in terms of them, as in quantum mechanics. In a certain way, imaginary numbers are, despite their name, unimaginable. But the implicit criterion of imagination at work, picturing 3i sheep, for example, that's inappropriate to the case. Like the middle schooler, we will need to reconcile ourselves with a certain sort of dissatisfaction. It's incoherent to attempt to imagine in any determinate way what it would be like to be in a borderline state of consciousness, since there's nothing determinate it would be like. No first-person imaginative transportation or phenomenological memory will give us a good handle on the idea. Now, maybe if we had a well-developed consensus theory of consciousness, we could get a good handle on the idea through application of that theory, like the middle schooler eventually becomes comfortable with imaginary numbers. But consciousness science is still contentious and underdeveloped. So I don't blame you. If you'd like more by way of positive characterization of borderline consciousness, it's totally understandable, right? But from the fact that I cannot seize the culprit and display their physiognomy, it does not follow that the jewels were stolen by no one. All right, so I'm going to skip 2 pieces of this project, which contrast my view with Papineau's and address Antony and Simon's objections to the possibility of borderline cases. The short version of my reply to Antony and Simon is that they're advancing versions of the paradoxically illegitimate demand that I just discussed. All right, so I'm going to conclude with some possible cases and applications, right? So if borderline consciousness exists, where do we expect to find it? And what implications would its existence have? Let's start with where. In non-human animals of intermediate sophistication, right? If we reject human exceptionalism, panpsychism, and saltation views, then we ought to predict that some non-human animals would be borderline conscious. Exactly which animals will depend on which theory of consciousness is true. If consciousness requires sophisticated self-representations, perhaps social mammals and birds with good but subhuman theory of mind capacities would be borderline conscious. If consciousness requires flexible learning of the sort present in bees, but apparently not in simple gastropods like the sea hare, then maybe sophisticated gastropods like terrestrial snails and slugs would have borderline consciousness. If we assume that the fertilized egg is not yet conscious and the newborn infant is conscious, then we might expect a period during which the fetus is borderline conscious. Presumably, at least some neural differentiation would be required, but how far along in development such an in-between phase occurs and how long it persists will depend on which theory of consciousness is correct. If we assume that there are at least some moments of dreamless sleep, sedation under anesthesia, or traumatic brain injury during which people are determinately non-conscious, and if empirical evidence continues to suggest that the transition can sometimes be gradual between these states and determinately conscious states, then we might expect borderline consciousness in some of these transit or semi-conscious states. Now, in these first 3 cases, the entire organism is in a borderline state of consciousness. But there might also be borderline conscious states in organisms that are determinately conscious at the moment in question. Right? So, for example, perceptual states near the limit of conscious perceivability, right? A visual stimulus that's presented for 200 milliseconds, then masked, will ordinarily be consciously perceived by most research participants. A visual stimulus presented for only 30 milliseconds, then masked, will ordinarily not be consciously perceived, though it might influence future behavior, at least on standard views. At intermediate presentation lengths between 330 and 200, participants will often be uncertain whether a stimulus was presented. Now, while it's possible that in all such cases the stimulus was either determinately experienced or determinately not experienced, another possibility is that in some such cases the stimulus is borderline conscious. For example, on a theory of consciousness that ties consciousness closely to reportability, the stimulus might be borderline reportable, right? Reportable given certain prompts or response modalities, but not given other prompts or response modalities. Something similar might be possible for a tone that fades slowly into silence, or a scent that fades slowly as you stroll away from its source. Maybe we get borderline cases in perception without attention, right? There's considerable debate about the extent to which consciousness can overflow attention, in Ned Block's phrasing, if it can do so at all. Do you have constant tactile experience of your feet in your shoes? Do you normally experience the background hum of the refrigerator, or do these things fade from consciousness as soon as they fade from attention? If you're presented with a complex visual display, and then given a demanding task that requires you only to attend to a portion of that display, do you experience the unattended portions of the display? Now, maybe every well-framed question of the sort deserves a determinate yes or no answer. But if borderline consciousness is possible, then some such cases might involve borderline consciousness. This might be an especially natural view if consciousness is closely linked to attention, and if attention is a graded phenomenon. Another possible set of cases are fringe consciousness cases in the sense of Bruce Magnan. Do you have a conscious experience of willing the actions that you take? Are there a half dozen thoughts always kind of hanging out, so to speak, on the fringe of your awareness? Do you have constant half-conscious expectations about what's about to happen in your environment? We might consider the possibility that some such processes are borderline conscious. Now, I'm not committing to the existence of borderline consciousness in any one type of case here. What I'm arguing is that the graded basis of consciousness makes it likely that borderline consciousness occurs sometimes, somewhere. Now, if the possible existence of borderline consciousness is accepted, debates about animal consciousness, consciousness without attention, and so on might become less stark than they currently seem. If the only options are determinate presence or determinate absence of consciousness, then it's black versus white. With borderline consciousness, shades of gray become possible. I leave applications of to the moral status of animals and to the aesthetic value of background music as exercises for you to try at home.